Another edition of the Black and Happy Show, and of course I'm happy today dealing with civil rights, black history, Negro history, and African American history, anyway, from past to present. And with us today is Dr. C.T. Vivian. Dr. C.T. Vivian, a lot of you are familiar with the name, is the director of, currently the director of BASIC. He has too long of a history to just say he's the director of BASIC and popped out of the woodwork. So I'm going to turn to my right, and so you can get a chance to see him. And this is Dr. Vivian. Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to our show. Let's start off with the classic, only because I wrote it down. What Happens to a Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes. You've been with SCLC, which is, let's start there and just come back up to the BASIC, which is called an Action Training Discovery Learning Workshop that you're doing now. Give us just a little history of SCLC. What do the letters stand for, and what is it?
SCLC stands for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You see, really what happened is when Dr. King moved in Montgomery, Alabama, and they won it, Dr. King did something that others of us were not able to see. He began to say the method of nonviolent direct action should be used across the entire Southland for the destruction of racism everywhere, right? So he and Reverend Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth, who had been active, and two or three other men who were concerned, and they largely had known each other as ministers across Alabama, met, and one of them was in Florida, C.K. Steele. Reverend C.K. Steele was in Florida, in Tallahassee. They met, and they formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, these 5 leaders. Then they called a conference of ministers across the entire South. I was in Nashville at the time, and they were calling pastors. I was an editor at the Sunday School Publishing Board. I was an editor, it's good enough. And Kelly Miller Smith, who was pastor of First Baptist Church, went from our city. He came back. Well, I was the only one that knew anything about nonviolence, had really participated. So immediately I became head of direct action. And this was happening all over the South, however, as people were coming together.
Just let me interrupt you.
Sure.
When you say South, are there certain states?
Sure.
Because I'm originally from Ohio.
Sure.
But when I'm up here, they say you're from down south. And when we're saying the South, what is that border?
It's called the Mason and Dixon line.
Okay.
You see, historically, when we talk South, what we're talking about is those states that were part of the Confederacy. All right. And then when we talk North, we're talking about those states that were not. Okay. All right. Is it stayed with the federal government? So that as soon as you drop below Virginia, right, and you can almost make a line clear across the nation from there, right, from the bottom of Virginia, it goes down like this and it goes across, is that you're dealing with southern states. There's 13 southern states, basically. Right? And so when you start talking about Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and South Carolina and North Carolina and all of those states, you're talking about the South, all right? And Ohio is the Midwest. They may not know it out this far east, but it's the Midwest where I come from. I come from Illinois originally, all right? Cincinnati, Ohio, however, used to be the change point, right? Is that when but you see, you were leaving Ohio then, going across the river. As soon as the train came into Cincinnati, then you no longer had to be in a segregated car. If you were coming from the south-north, Cincinnati was the change point. You no longer had to be in a segregated car because you were in Ohio now. You were not in a segregated state. But as soon as you left Ohio, if you were leaving Ohio going south, all right, that was the stop. So you had to be in a segregated train going because as soon as you crossed the river, you were what? You were into Kentucky. Kentucky is what? Kentucky is a southern state. You see what I mean? So that's how they figured it. But what you're really talking about is those countries that made up, those states that made up the Confederacy, and those states that didn't.
Now, when you were talking before we came on in reference to a sit-in and demonstration being done in 1947, but I guess
Sure.
we didn't have enough press there to get as much coverage as they did.
Well,
for
it was
Rosa
also,
Parks,
that
so-
was true, but it was more than that. And I
Okay.
think that's why we see the greatness. For instance, is that sometimes we forget that all through the North, Chicago, Illinois, right, as well. If you were downtown in the Loop, you couldn't eat at a restaurant downtown in the Loop in the 1930s and before, right? It was true of Cincinnati. It was true of Columbus, Ohio. It was true of everywhere. It was true of Cleveland, just your state. It's true of my state, too. We're
Right.
both northern states, right?
Right.
But when it came to the normal kinds of rights that everybody had to, you did not have them. In Peoria, Illinois, for instance, there was one restaurant downtown we could eat in, and then there were certain seats near the back of which that you felt comfortable in and knew nobody was going to say anything to you, right? Now, you didn't have to go into the kitchen like in down south, but I mean, they were near the back and say anything to you. Well, we stopped that. We changed that by simply creating demonstrations. We learned that from James Farmer, who first did it in Chicago, Illinois. All right, so that sometimes we get mixed up between what was and what is what we thought always was and
Right.
what is. All right. In fact, we have a way now of saying is that we call it down south and up south. All right, because we have to. In those days we were not free enough to say up south because we did not want to believe that if you were in the north things were as bad as in the south.
Right.
Well, technically they were not, but racism was throughout the entire nation.
Right. Have you noticed any changes now?
Yeah, well, there's one line that one of my peers uses, that everything has changed, but nothing has changed. Meaning that everything's changed on the surfaces, but nothing's really changed underneath. The statistics will give us an understanding of that. Right? For instance, 36% of black families right now live under the poverty level. That's higher than it's been at any time since they've been keeping figures. Now, I'm quoting directly from the study.
Because they weren't keeping figures
And
always.
That's right, because they didn't even care to keep figures on
Right.
us at one time.
Right.
All right. In fact, it was the actions of World War II and the movement of the 1960s that made them really get serious about even keeping figures on us. All right.
Right.
So, but even if you'd say 1960. The figures are now worse than at any period we've ever had. Right? So, that they've kept figures. In other words, since the new movement started. So things are going backwards, not forward. We could do it in jobs. And we begin to look, is that somewhere between 40, 45, and 50% of black males do not have a steady job in America.
But what do you
That's
think
if
the
you
cause is
include
that?
all. Racism. It's just
Okay.
that simple. Is that, and you have to remember that we've had 8 years of the Reagan administration that tried to turn the clock back on every right that blacks won,
Right.
or re-won actually, during the 1960s and
Right.
70s. The idea was to turn it back. They have tried to destroy everything that we worked for. Right? Well, when you're in fact dealing with understandings like that, and when the people who are in charge of the nation do not take seriously your rights, given the racist nature of this nation for so long, no one else will, or a few other people will, right? So that we've had a return to racism like we never thought would happen again, to the fact that even the colleges and universities, people are openly attacked at various times. Right?
Right,
Not only talked
yeah.
about negatively, but have been openly attacked.
Do you have a handle on why you're mentioning that? Because I'm out of touch with it, and I'm not really clear on. I think a couple of weeks ago, I forget the guy's name, but he was running for office, and they were accusing the black guy who they was trying to make head somewhere in the government as far as Lucas. Lucas was being nominated,
Yeah.
and they were saying he wasn't.
He wasn't.
They didn't nominate him because he wasn't aware of the recent changes in the Supreme Court, and I was wondering if you had a handle on what some of those changes or those rollbacks
which
were
would
that
take
they
a
were
whole
talking
program by itself. In fact,
Okay.
what you see here again is the strategy of the far right, or the right. The strategy of the right was to take over the Supreme Court and the federal judgeships. They've been working on that ever since Nixon. It was a part of turning back the rights and privileges of blacks, of women, of those who were won in the 1950s and 60s. All right?
Okay.
When I say blacks, I mean all minorities. All right? So we see it start under Nixon, but we see it finally, they come to take over the Supreme Court under Reagan, right?
Right.
And we got judgeships throughout this United States. Right. For instance, I was just talking to an attorney that's in New York that was telling me, who went to school at the University of North Carolina, as a real white fellow, a real hard civil rights lawyer, though white, and he said that every Republican that went to school with him at the University of North Carolina Law School is now a judge. Now a federal judge, was in his class, is now a federal judge, right? The idea was to make the conservatives judges so that they would control the courts from now on.
Right.
Right? And so that when we look at what has happened is that they have made, say it quickly, they've created a whole set of new processes.
Okay.
See, so that it makes it difficult for anybody to gain his rights.
Okay.
See, they didn't say that the heart of the idea is wrong, but they just went through, they have you to go through so many processes that makes it almost impossible, or nearly impossible, for a poor person, all right, to in fact make those rights, so that the big businesses, the institutions of the culture, in other words, can almost do anything they want to you, and you have little or no real regress in reality terms.
Okay.
Technically, you do.
Okay.
Reality terms, you do.
Okay. Hold it just 1 second. We're supposed to take a break.
Almost 400 years ago, African Americans were brought to this continent in chains. Stripped of their dignity, torn from their families, they never surrendered till they were free. Don't dishonor them by becoming a slave to heroin, cocaine, and crack. Make no mistake, drug abuse is the new slavery.